Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Crypto Deep Dive, the show where we dissect the blockchain world one layer at a time. I'm Lori.
And I'm Nick.
Welcome back, Nick, my deep diving crypto buddy. So, this is going to be a two-part episode. There is just too much to stuff into one go, but before we immerse ourselves into the world of the XRP Escrow, let's take a quick look at the market as it stands right now.
Sure, go ahead.
Today, Tuesday, 13th of May, 2025, the charts look a bit like Santa is on the way, a lot of red and green mixed. Bitcoin is up at 104,049 US dollars. Ethereum is sitting at about $2,608, and XRP is at 2.5504. We've got XLM at a bit under 31.5 cents. Sol is up at around $178.2, and ADA is trading at just under 82 cents. So pretty much flat since yesterday. Back over to you.
Right, let's get going with the main star of the show. Today, we're diving into one of the more technical and sometimes controversial aspects of the Ripple ecosystem, the XRP Escrow.
All right, so I'll pretend it's the first time I hear about this. I've seen the term escrow thrown around in the XRP community for a while, but I've always wondered, what does it actually mean in the context of crypto?
Great starting point. So in traditional finance, an escrow is basically a financial arrangement where a third party holds and regulates the payment of funds required for two parties involved in a transaction. It adds a layer of security.
So it's like a vault that only opens under specific conditions?
Exactly. In crypto, that concept translates into smart contracts, code that governs when and how funds are released. XRP's escrow works just like that, but with some unique characteristics.
Got it. So why did Ripple even introduce the XRP escrow in the first place? Got it. So why did Ripple even introduce the XRP escrow in the first place?
Back in 2017, Ripple faced a credibility issue. They held a massive portion of the total XRP supply, about 55 billion out of 100 billion XRP, and that made investors nervous. People feared Ripple could flood the market and tank the price at any moment.
That's a legitimate concern. I mean, that's more than half the total supply.
Exactly, it created uncertainty in the market. Investors were asking, what's stopping Ripple from dumping these tokens? To address those fears, Ripple made a bold move by voluntarily locking up those 55 billion XRP tokens in escrow contracts.
So it was really about building trust with the community?
Precisely, it was a strategic decision to demonstrate long-term commitment to the XRP ecosystem. By cryptographically securing those tokens in escrow, Ripple essentially said, we can't access all of these at once, even if we wanted to.
How transparent was this process? Did they announce it publicly?
Very transparent. They made a formal announcement, explained the mechanics in detail, and executed the lockup on the public XRP Ledger where anyone could verify it. This wasn't something done behind closed doors, it was designed specifically to be verifiable by the community.
How does that release mechanism work, practically speaking?
It's actually quite elegant. Each month, one escrow contract expires and releases 1 billion XRP to Ripple. This happens automatically through the code built into the XRP Ledger.
So Ripple gets access to 1 billion XRP every month? That still sounds like a lot.
Yes, but here's the key part. Ripple only uses what they need for their operations, partnerships, and market development. The fascinating thing is what happens to the unused portion.
What does happen to it?
Any unused XRP from that monthly release goes back into a new escrow contract at the end of the queue. So if Ripple only uses, say, 200 million XRP in a month, the remaining 800 million gets locked up again for another 55 months.
So they're essentially extending the timeline with each release cycle?
Exactly. This creates a rolling schedule. Instead of a hard 55-month timeline, it stretches much further into the future. Based on their usage patterns so far, these escrows could last for many years beyond the original plan.
What's Ripple's actual usage pattern been like? Are they using most of it or returning most?
Historically, they've returned the majority to escrow. On average, Ripple has used something like 200 to 300 million XRP per month and returned about 700 to 800 million. This approach has significantly extended the timeline of the original escrow system.
That's quite a responsible approach, especially considering they could technically use all billion each month if they wanted to. Is this handled purely through smart contracts on the XRP Ledger?
Yes, the XRP Ledger has built-in support for escrow transactions. These contracts are time-locked and cannot be altered, which adds a level of security and trust.
So this isn't something Ripple just promises to do, it's actually enforced by code?
That's right, it's all coded directly into the XRP Ledger protocol. The escrow feature was specifically designed to enable these time-based releases with cryptographic security. Once the escrow contracts are set up, not even Ripple can change the terms.
How technically complex is this escrow system?
It's surprisingly elegant in its design. The XRP Ledger has a specific transaction type called escrow create that locks the tokens and sets a release condition based on time. When that time arrives, an escrow finished transaction can be executed to release the funds.
And there's no backdoor or override mechanism?
None whatsoever. That's what makes it trustworthy. The conditions are immutably written into the ledger, and the escrow can only conclude when those specific conditions are met. Even if Ripple wanted to access those funds early, they couldn't. The consensus protocol would reject any attempt.
That's actually quite impressive from a technical standpoint.
It really is, and it demonstrates how blockchain technology can be used to create transparent, trustless arrangements that give certainty to all participants in the ecosystem.
So how does this escrow system actually impact XRP's price and supply dynamics in the market?
This is where things get really interesting. The escrow system ensures that XRP enters the market at a controlled, predictable rate. In theory, this should reduce volatility and create a more stable price environment.
But I'm guessing not everyone sees it that way?
Exactly right. There are two very distinct perspectives here. Supporters argue that by preventing sudden supply shocks, the escrow mechanism creates healthy, organic price discovery. They see it as responsible tokenomics.
And the critics?
Critics contend that despite the transparency, this system still gives Ripple enormous influence over XRP's supply. They argue that even with the escrow, Ripple effectively controls when and how much XRP enters circulation, which could be seen as a form of centralized market management.
I imagine the monthly releases must create some market patterns too, right?
Absolutely, we often see price movements around release dates as traders anticipate potential selling pressure. Some analysts have even developed trading strategies specifically around these escrow release cycles.
Is there evidence that Ripple actually sells significant amounts from these monthly releases?
That's another point of contention. Ripple publishes quarterly reports showing exactly how much XRP they've sold, and historically it's been substantially less than what's released each month. But the mere possibility of sales can influence market sentiment. What's fascinating is how the community has developed such sophisticated on-chain analysis to track these movements. Every transaction from Ripple's known wallets gets scrutinized.
So it sounds like the escrow has created this strange dynamic where transparency itself has become both a feature and a source of market anxiety.
That's a perfect way to put it. The predictability creates stability, but also creates predictable moments of potential volatility. It's a fascinating paradox.
What about investor sentiment? Do these monthly releases create anxiety or confidence in the market?
A bit of both, actually. For seasoned XRP investors who understand the mechanics, the predictability can be quite reassuring. They know exactly when releases happen and roughly how much Ripple typically uses versus returns to escrow.
So experienced investors might actually find comfort in the transparency?
Precisely. Veterans in the XRP community often track these releases without much concern. They've seen the pattern over years. Ripple generally uses only a fraction of each billion and returns the rest. This predictability becomes a source of stability for long-term holders.
But I'm guessing newer investors might see things differently.
That's absolutely right. Newcomers to XRP often misinterpret the monthly unlocks. They see headlines about 1 billion XRP being released and panic, thinking it's an imminent sell-off that will crash the market. This misconception creates unnecessary anxiety and sometimes even panic selling.
Do these release dates cause noticeable market patterns?
We do see some cyclical behavior. There's often a small dip a few days before scheduled releases as newer traders position defensively. Then, when the market doesn't crash as feared, prices tend to recover. Some savvy traders have even built strategies around these predictable sentiment swings.
So essentially perception shapes reality in this case?
Exactly. The actual economic impact of the escrow releases is far less significant than the psychological impact on different investor segments. It's a fascinating study in market psychology and how the same transparent mechanism can create completely different reactions based on experience level.
This has all been absolutely fascinating, Nick. We've covered a lot of ground on the XRP escrow system, from its origins and mechanisms to how it impacts market dynamics and investor psychology.
We certainly have, and I think we're just scratching the surface of this complex topic. There's so much more to explore about the long-term implications and future scenarios.
I agree completely, but if we continue at this pace, we'll definitely exceed our 10-minute target for episodes, and we both know how much we try to keep things concise for our listeners.
You're absolutely right. Let's pause here for part 1 and pick up the rest in part 2. We still need to dive into the regulatory aspects, Ripple's actual usage patterns, and what happens when the escrow eventually ends.
Perfect. So everyone, be sure to tune in for part 2, where we'll continue unpacking the complexities of the XRP escrow system.